Hello everyone, welcome to today's lecture where we will dive deep into the world of podcast branding. In podcasting, branding defines how your podcast is recognized and understood by your audience. It's reflected in the way you design your cover art, the intro music you use, the themes you discuss, and even the consistency of your release schedule. All of these elements contribute to the identity and personality of your podcast, shaping the way your audience perceive it. Purpose of the branding in podcasting. With thousands of podcasts available on every topic imaginable, a strong brand is what makes your podcast stand out and draw listeners in. First of all, creating a unique identity. Your brand acts as a signal to potential listeners about what they can expect. It answers the question, what makes this podcast different? For example, a true crime podcast that focused on lesser known cases might differentiate itself from others by emphasizing a more investigative journalistic approach. Your brand is the promise you make to your listeners, and it's what keeps them coming back. Second, building trust and loyalty. Consistency is key in branding. A strong brand ensures that every aspect of your podcast aligns with its identity, from episode content to marketing. Over time, this consistency builds trust. When listeners know what to expect, they are more likely to remain loyal, becoming repeat listeners, and sharing your podcast with others. And third, a tool for growth. Branding plays a significant role in word of mouth marketing, as a recognizable and engaging brand is more likely to spread organically. Additionally, branding makes it easier for potential sponsors and collaborators to understand what your podcast is about and how it aligns with their own values or goals. Key elements of branding a podcast. Podcast name. It's the most crucial element of your podcast. It's often the first thing people encounter, so good podcast name should be memorable. A name that sticks with people makes it easier for them to recommend your podcast to others or search for it later. Searchable. SEO-friendly names help increase discoverability on platforms like Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Avoid overly generic or obscure names that could be lost in these attempts to find the popular content. Unique. Your podcast name should stand out in a crowded field. It needs to avoid sounding too similar to other shows to reduce confusion and copyright issues. Example: Science vs is an example of a name that's memorable, searchable, and unique. It clearly conveys that the show tackles science-based debates, setting listener expectations instantly. Logo and visual identity. The logo, along with the color scheme and font choices, gives your podcast a visual personality that reinforces its content and tone. These elements should reflect what your podcast is about and the emotions you want to evoke in your audience. Consistency. Consistent visual elements help build recognition across different platforms, social media channels, and promotional materials. Whether it's your website, social media posts, or cover art, your audience should instantly associate the visual identity with your podcast. Reflective of your content. The colors, fonts, and design style should align with the tone and the theme of your show. A podcast focused on true crime may use darker tones and minimalist fonts, while a comedy podcast might use bright, playful colors and fun fonts. Example: the Daily Podcast uses a bold, minimalist logo with a striking blue and yellow color scheme that reflects its direct, news-focused content. The visual identity is clean and professional, reinforcing its serious and factual tone. Tagline is a short, impactful sentence or phrase that summarizes your podcast mission or theme. It's an extension of your podcast name and helps clarify what your audience can expect from the show. Concise and clear, a good tagline communicates the essence of your podcast in a few words. It should be clear, direct, and ideally hint at the tone, humorous, serious, or informative, and content, science, entertainment, lifestyle. Memorable, just like your podcast name, the tagline should be easy to remember. Think of it as a slogan that gets stuck in people's mind, helping them recall your podcast even if they don't see your logo or episode title. Example, How I Built This uses the tagline Stories Behind the People Who Created the World's Best Known Companies. It's concise, memorable, and immediately tells listeners that they will hear stories of building business. Theme music and intro. Your podcast theme music are key. Yes, it's the first thing that will drag your audience into the understanding, identifying your branding. These elements set the mood and tone of your show before the content even begins, creating an immediate emotional connection with listeners. Theme music, you should choose something that is matching with podcast content and audience expectations. It can be a bit for a light-hearted show or more intense for a serious one. Intros and outros. A consistent introduction helps set the stage for each episode. It should include your podcast name, the episode number or guest introduction if relevant, and a brief statement about the topic. The outro serves as a closing remark, often including calls to action like subscribing or following on social media. Example, Radiolab uses distinctive experimental music in its intro that reflects its curiosity-driven content. Over time, this unique sound has become synonymous with the podcast itself, making it easily recognizable. Podcast cover art. Podcast cover art is the visual front of your show on platforms like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts. It's often the first thing potential listeners see when browsing, so it needs to be eye-catching and informative. High quality and professional cover art should be designed with attention to detail. A high-resolution image ensures that it looks sharp on all platforms, whether on a smartphone screen or desktop. A well-designed cover signals professionalism and helps attract new listeners. And of course, visually appealing and on branding. The cover art must be aligned with the podcast tone and content. It should be a visual clue about what your show is about. If your podcast is about tech, for example, you might use sleek, modern design elements, while a podcast about travel might use vibrant colors and scenic imagery. Example, Reply All has a simple yet bold cover art featuring their name in a unique font against a bright orange background. This clean, modern design stands out on crowded platforms, and the font and the color choice reflect the podcast's edgy, tech-centric content. Audience targeting, knowing who your audience is play a major role in shaping your podcast branding, content, and style. Understanding your listeners' interests, behaviors, and demographics allows you to align your podcast mission and branding with what will resonate most with them. So identify, first of all, audience segment. To properly target your audience, first of all, you need to do these first things. Demographic and psychographic traits of your ideal listeners. Are they young professionals, parents? They have some hobby, or they students? Do they prefer in-depth discussions or quick, actionable insights? Understanding your audience preferences allow you to tailor your content and branding to meet their needs and expectations. Aligning branding with the audience. Your podcast's visual identity, tone, voice, and even episode length should align with what appeals to your target audience. For example, a podcast targeting busy professionals might benefit from shorter episodes, while a show catering to a more niche audience like history buffs might feature longer, more detailed content. Content relevance. Yes, knowing your audience, you ensure that the topics you cover are relevant and engaging. If you're targeting fitness enthusiasts, for example, creating episodes focused on mental health or diet trends would be more appealing than unrelated subjects. Example, Call Your Girlfriend, a podcast targeting millennial women. Use a conversational tone and cover topics like pop culture, feminism, and friendship, aligning well with its audience interests.
You'll learn exactly why it's essential to have a cohesive brand for your podcast. And because I don't want to leave you hanging, how to create one. Here we go! Whether you like it or not, the mere fact that you have a podcast means that you have a brand. So let's talk about what a brand is. Yes, you do need things like a logo and a color scheme, but that's not what makes a brand. A brand is a message that you want to convey to others about what your podcast is and who it's for. Think Apple and Coca-Cola. When you think of their names or even look at their logo, you know exactly what they create and who they create it for. In the case of Apple, their company makes great electronics and they aim for people who like innovation. So how does this translate to podcasts? Well, if you've ever been to the romance section in your nearest Barnes & Noble, you'll see a lot of lighthearted romance novels with illustrations on their covers. Well, there's a show called Honeymoon for One, and their podcast artwork has illustrations that mimic many of those books that you see on the shelves. What's so cool about that is as soon as you see the podcast artwork, you'll get a sense of what it's about and the style even before you press play. Now that you know what a brand is, let's talk about what makes a cohesive brand. In a nutshell, a cohesive brand is where all of your brand assets match. So your brand assets are the title, the podcast artwork, any social media templates, fonts or color schemes, even your show description, so that anybody can go to any of these platforms online, whether that's your website, your social media profiles, or even your email newsletter, and know exactly what your show is, who it's for, and what it's about. Now that you know what is a cohesive brand, why do you need one? Well, first off, it makes it easier for people to know what your show is about. And the more they know what it's about, it makes it easier for listeners to recommend it. Word of mouth is one of the best ways to grow your show. So you want to make it easy for your listeners to tell other people about your show, what it's about, and why they should listen to it. Next, it helps you build trust with your listeners because they know exactly what to expect from your show. It also makes your show look more professional or credible to advertisers and sponsors if you're looking to monetize or if you're already monetizing. Just because you know what a cohesive brand is doesn't mean that you know how to translate that to your show. So start doing some research of some shows that you like or you really feel have a cohesive brand. What makes them cohesive? Is it the podcast artwork? Is it the color scheme? Is it the fact that it looks like the cover of a romance novel? What exactly is it? And jot all those things down. As promised, I'm not going to leave you hanging. So here is exactly how you can create a cohesive brand. The first thing you want to do is come up with a list of words to describe the tone and the feel of your show. You don't want to have too many words, so 3 to 5 is really good to start with. And these will help you narrow in and focus on what your brand is going to be. So if you have a parenting podcast, your list of words could be encouraging, supportive, and motivational. Next, create a tagline. A tagline is merely a short description of your show that your listeners can look at right away and understand what it's about and whether it's for them. So think Nike's Just Do It or Apple's Think Different. These taglines help the audience identify exactly what the brand is about. Next, consider color schemes and images. If you have an existing show, scrutinize the color schemes and images and think about how you can make it a lot more cohesive. Stick with one color scheme for all your social media platforms, website, podcast, artwork, email newsletter, or wherever your show has an online presence. You'll want to use images that align with the words that you use to describe your show. Going back to the parenting podcast example, you want to pick images that are supportive, encouraging, and motivational. The final step is to create an elevator pitch. Now, there isn't one set length as to how long your elevator pitch should be, but it should be long enough that you can convey what your show is, what it's about, and why someone should listen to it. Once you've created your elevator pitch, it's a smart idea to use this as part of your podcast description. That's it. If you follow these tips, you'll be well on your way to creating a cohesive brand. Let us know in the comments below on what changes you've made to help make your podcast branding more cohesive. Since podcast artwork is an important part of your brand, we have a video all about it.
Content strategy as part of branding is key when it comes to reinforcing your podcast brand identity. This includes maintaining a regular release schedule, standard episode length, and a clear topic focus. So, about release schedule, your audience expects reliability. If you release episodes sporadically or with long gaps, it can disrupt listeners' engagement and dilute your brand's credibility. Establish a consistent release schedule, whether weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly, and stick to it. This builds anticipation and trust with your listeners. For instance, Serial became popular not only for its gripping storytelling, but for releasing episodes predictably, keeping audience eager for the next installment. Episode length. Maintaining consistent episode length is another way to solidify your brand. Listeners will adapt their habits to accommodate your show, whether they expect a 15-minute quick tip or a 1-hour deep dive. Inconsistencies in episode length can disrupt those habits and make it harder for your audience to integrate your podcast into their routine. Shifting too far from your core topics can confuse listeners or alienate those who subscribe for a specific type of content. A podcast focused on personal finance tips. A podcast focused on personal finance tips, for example, should maintain that focus rather than branching into unrelated subjects like pop culture or fitness. This focus helps build authority and trust in your niche. Why niche matter? In an increasingly crowded podcast landscape, targeting a niche market allows you to stand out among generalist podcasts. By focusing on a specific subject or demographic, you can tailor your content to meet the exact needs and desires of your target audience, which increases engagement and loyalty. For example, the Pen Addict podcast focuses on pens, paper, and stationery, a hyper-specific niche that resonates deeply with a passionate community. About building authority. A strong niche focus helps establish your podcast as an authority in this specific field. Listeners will return to your podcast as a trusted source of expertise and insight, reinforcing their connection to your brand. If your podcast covers sustainable fashion, for example, you build credibility by discussing eco-friendly practices and industry trends. Strengthening identity. A well-defined niche provides clarity for your podcast branding, making it easier for listeners to understand what you stand for. This clarity allows you to create targeted marketing and brand messages that resonate more deeply with your audience. Branding across platforms and mediums. When it comes to gaining exposure, podcast directories like iTunes and podcast.net are indispensable. Each platform has its submission process and specific requirements. For instance, iTunes requires podcasts to include custom RSS tags to display additional information such as the podcast subtitle, author, and summary. Submitting to iTunes also required metadata like categories and explicit content rating. Following these guidelines ensures that your podcast is more likely to be accepted and searchable by potential listeners. Other directories such as podcastpickle.com and Podcastly News are also valuable places to list your show. Each directory has a different audience, and the more places your podcast appears, the better your chances of gaining listeners. For example, podcastpickle.com is highly community-driven with a focus on listener engagement, while Feedster searches RSS feeds, allowing listeners to find podcasts by keywords. Social media strategy, of course, you should have accounts, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. They should reflect your podcast branding through consistent use of colors, fonts, and logos in post and visuals. Social media is not just a broadcasting tool, it's a way to connect with your audience in real time. It's not just enough to do podcast, yes. We need to inform that here we are, you can find us here and there. Engaging with comments, reposting fan content, and using interactive features like polls or Q&A sessions helps deepen listener relationships. For example, podcasts like Stuff You Should Know regularly engage their community on Instagram by replying to comments, which strengthen listeners' loyalty and amplify the brand's reaches. Website and SEO. Your podcast website acts as a central hub for your brand, offering a space where listeners can find episodes, show notes, and additional resources. Search engine optimization (SEO) plays a significant role in increasing the discoverability of your podcast by ensuring that your podcast ranks well in search engines. Optimizing your website with the branding keywords like podcast name, episode title, guest names, and topics helps search engines rank your podcast higher when users search for relevant content. Incorporating metadata, proper titles, and descriptions in your website content increases its chances of being found by potential listeners searching for related subjects. For example, Pat Flynn's Smart Passive Income podcast is a prime example of successful SEO integration in podcasting. He optimized episodes titled with popular search terms such as how to start an online business in 2024, making his content easily discoverable on search engines and directories. Each episode is supported by detailed, keyword-rich show notes on his website, which rank on Google and drive organic traffic. Use Google AdWords Traffic Estimator to test the market for your podcast theme or concept, helping you to increase audience interest before investing heavily. When promoting, make sure that all marketing materials from flyers to business cards include your podcast name, website, and subscription details. In summary, podcast branding is crucial for establishing your show's identity and connecting with your audience. Key elements like your broadcast name, logo, theme music, and content consistency all play a role in setting your podcast apart and building listener loyalty. A strong, well-defined brand helps attract and retain listeners, while also providing a foundation for growth and adaptability. Thank you for your attention today and see you in the next